On behalf of the Kappa Omicron chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, we would like to welcome you to our first annual Hazing Prevention Week. Hazing is any action or any situation created intentionally that causes embarrassment, harassment, or ridicule and risk emotional and or physical harm to members of a group or team, whether new or not, regardless of the person's willingness to participate. National Hazing Prevention Week is September 22nd through the 26th. National Hazing Prevention Week is an opportunity for campuses, schools, communities, organizations, and individuals to raise awareness about the problem of hazing and to educate others about hazing and promote the prevention of hazing. The Kappa Omicron chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated is participating in its first annual Hazing Prevention Week to raise awareness about the practices and rituals of hazing and to educate the UNC community about the surrounding areas about the emotional, social, and psychological effects of hazing. For young people, the desire to belong can be so strong that mental or physical abuse seems a tolerable price for admission. Dr. Shiela McKoy can attest to the impact of the violence of belonging as she has witnessed the implications of hazing firsthand. Dr. Shiela McKoy is an associate professor of English and Africana Studies at North Carolina State University. She is also editor of the literary journal Obsidian Literature in the African Diaspora. Her book, When Whites Riot, Writing Race and Violence in American and South African Cultures, reflects her interest in the relationships among African and African diaspora cultures. Smith-McCoy's critical work, poetry and fiction, has appeared in numerous publications, including the Schomburg series, African American Women Writers, Contours, Obsidian Literature in the African Diaspora, and Research for African Literatures and Medium. She is a writer, director, and producer of the documentary films St. Agnes, The Untold Story, and Opening Doors. The Lives and Legacies of Dr. Lawrence M. Clark and Dr. Augustus M. Witherspoon. Dr. Smith-McKoy also has a special interest in healing and healing traditions, especially those grounded in African traditional knowledge. An active and avid anti-hazing activist, Dr. Smith-McKoy's anti-hazing work arises out of her personal experiences and in her interest in supporting hazing survivors like her son, Raymond Smith-McKoy, who must approach every day differently because of the impact of hazing. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Shiela Smith-McKoy.
Thank you, Brittany, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for being here. My son, Raymond Smith-McKoy, was the victim of hazing, and we'll talk about his experience in great detail. But first, I want to talk to you about issues related to hazing. So, you've already received a short definition of what hazing is. So, I want us to think about a few questions as we go through this, just personally for you to think about as you consider how you can be an anti-hazing activist and why it's important. And so the first thing I want you to think about is, what does a hazer hope to accomplish through hazing? One of the things that hazing does is that it begets other hazing. And in part it's because it's happened to you. You either believe that it's necessary, that it's purposeful, and you want to make sure that you do something to the people in front of you, so if it's necessary and purposeful, that it will also happen within. Also, some people use this as an opportunity to get back, not of the people who hazed them, but the people that they now have power over. Sadly, this sort of power changes your brain chemistry. It releases dopamine, it feels good. And what does that mean you'll do after that? You'll haze again. Now that's the first question I want you to think about. The second one, what is the purpose of hazing? What does it serve? Many of you are legacies, meaning that someone in your family was already a member of a sorority or fraternity. It also means that you might be a part of a legacy where hazing was looked at differently than it is necessarily looked at now. It doesn't mean that hazing was correct then. It just means that it looked different in those days and we reacted to it differently. We'll share with you a narrative from a 1932 issue of the Crisis magazine. 1932, and the columnist was concerned that the brightest and the best students at Lincoln University were undergoing Hell Week And the purpose of it was what? To have their grades drop, to be a part of a social network that forever changed their abilities to be who they were. 1932. So what I want you to think about is, though there's a legacy of hazing in many of our organizations, it was never looked upon as a sound way to bring people in solid membership. Next question I want you to think about. What does it mean to be a woman and a man, and in part, to be a member of your organization? And how do you reconcile these definitions? Can you reconcile bringing someone in as a sister if they're brought in through violence? How do you reconcile bringing someone in as your brother if they are brought into that relationship through some measure of violence? So I want you to think a little bit about definitions of who you are and the intent from that. Next question I want you to consider is, how do you embrace membership in sisterhood or brotherhood? What does that mean? Is your sister or your brother there to lift you up or to pull you down? And I want you to think about these things as we go through the rest of our presentation. One last question. What are your individual, collective, and cultural responsibilities in eliminating hazing? Truly, you can affect change by your actions. You can affect change by making sure that your actions are recognized within your particular membership circle. But what are your cultural obligations as African American men and women, of people of African descent? What are your obligations to the larger community? What do you think about that? Okay. The next slide just does another definition of hazing. And I want to make sure that we understand the full range of this. It can be emotional, it can be physical, it can be mental, and it can be psychological in many kinds of ways. In my son's case, it was all of those, including sexual victimization in that participation. So hazing is not just somebody who shows up with marks. Hazing can be internalized in terms of the person who is the victim, and it also determines who is a victim and who can be a survivor. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we move along. Next slide. Next slide. So what is the impact of hazing? Pledges are engaged in a process that occurs in the midst of violence and or compulsion. That's pretty understandable. We understand what that means. Next one. The victim often keeps silent because of the consequences of betrayal. Often, people do not speak out because they love their organizations or they love the people who haze them. That's interesting to think about, but the perfect storm of hazing is somebody you love and respect and who is kind to you one moment and who is inexplicably and misunderstandingly violent with you the next. And then they can be kind to you, and then almost without warning, again, they become violent or abusive. And so it's the perfect storm. Part of what people keep silent about is because they care about the organization and they feel speaking out to be some sort of betrayal. Next one. Hazing adversely impacts self-esteem and concepts of the self. In my son's case, he was 19 years old when the hazing occurred. It was very difficult for him after a while to even be around young black men of his own age. He couldn't manage that association because in his own mind, although he was a 19-year-old black male, there was danger there. He felt differently about himself. And in many times, the hazing apparatus within our organizations are set up to do that. If you are a victim of hazing and you suffer from it, often people say, there must have been something wrong with you before. Or it couldn't have been just that did that to you. As if we understand everybody's personal feelings about themselves or their emotional makeup or their backgrounds. It's very difficult to look at someone and know they've had a trauma in their past that might be revisited because of your actions. And very simple things can break down your self-concept. This is particularly important for people of African descent in a society that's acculturated towards whiteness. It's particularly important in a society where, as a woman, in a society that's organized around male privilege. So we think clearly about that as well. Hazing victims often find themselves in a period of hypervigilance. That means they're always expecting something to happen. And so they begin to change their own behaviors so that that unexpected violence, that unexpected moment doesn't happen. That hypervigilance, though, also has a chemical reaction in the brain. I don't know, any human biology majors in our midst? Anybody ever seen the results of a lab experiment, a lab animal who's exposed to some sort of behaviors? Often they're shocked without explanation around the board. And then you study what happens to them. Do they become anxious or not? What happens in the human brain is that we get into an anxiety loop. You become hypervigilant, you expect the unexpected, that unexpected is going to be dangerous, and so you're in a hypervigilant, you're always in that moment of anxiety and expectation, and it keeps you in that cycle of unrest. And again, that can have long-term consequences because it can actually change the brain chemistry of the individual who's being hazed. And we'll talk more about that as we move along. And finally, hazing is perpetuated through a cycle of abuse. Again, those who are hazed often haze other people. People who are raised in the midst of domestic violence often grow up to be either victims or perpetuators of that violence. And this is really the situation that we're in. We're in these organizations because of love, because of sisterhood, because of respect, because we have people that we respect who are in these organizations, and we believe that things are going to be all right. But when you're faced with hazing, often it has a consequence, even though it's difficult for you during the time. Hazers find a way to haze again. So I want to talk a little bit about expectations in white fraternities and sororities. In all, the IFC organizations kill more people than any of the other organizations. More people die as a result of hazing in those situations. And usually that hazing is related to alcohol. We'll talk about that a little bit. It's of course linked to tradition, and therefore that's what legitimizes it. It happened in previous generations in the previous line. It's going to happen again. This is the right order of things. The second one I want you to think about is it's marked by high incidence of violence and sexual engagement. Often IFC fraternities will couple with Panhellenic organizations, and there's an expectation of sexual, if not sexual intercourse, then sexual play, and play acting around these roles. And that's the reason why, even though the national Panhellenic organizations have a lower rate of violence and a lower rate of death, they also have a higher incidence of self-esteem issues and people who get involved in drug culture because of body issues and self-esteem. Next one. It's also linked to proving that you're a man or a woman and the mental fortitude and physical prowess. And again, in this culture, and particularly at your age group, where sexual liaisons and coupling and finding a mate is so important at this time. And it sort of puts a backdrop against all that. And we have one other thing I want to talk to you about. Often it involves drinking rituals that lead to high incidence of death. Sometimes in these organizations, death occurs because of alcohol poisoning. But the vast majority of these deaths take place because individuals pass out. And instead of being immediately taken for medical care, they are left somewhere. Things are cleaned up. They're taken off to their dorm rooms or dropped off. So many of these deaths sadly are preventable. And the only reason why they die is because the organization seeks to protect itself rather than to protect the life of that individual who's been hazed. Now I want to contrast that with organizations that are Panhellenic organizations. So, like the first slide, is linked to tradition. This happened often in cases where you might be in the midst of a hazing situation or scenario, and you call home. If you're a legacy, often your parent will tell you, well, it happened to me, you just need to stick through it. And that idea of a legacy becomes perpetually entangled with what it means to be in the sisterhood. Next one. It's also marked by physical, mental, and emotional abuse. And that emotional abuse can also take on a different tenor as it relates to race. And I'll chat a little bit about that as we move along. Next one. It's linked to proven manhood or womanhood, and also sexual exclusivity. In many cases in the Panhellenic organizations, the idea of being in these organizations heightens your sexual exclusivity. You're not just available for anyone. You're on a higher order. And that becomes a part of the lure of being in the organization, and also a part of the lure as to why you would subject yourself or be subject to hazing. And the last one, I think, probably would be critically understandable to those of you here. You often have to prove that you are black enough, particularly on a white campus. How do you prove you're black enough? How do you do that? Do you get a DNA test? You right away to Ancestry.com and try to figure out just how African you are. How do you socialize that? And so particularly on a historically white campus, that also becomes a part of the scenario to prove that you're black enough, which is something that's impossible to do. We'll move on. I chose this particular quote to share with you. Andrew Luce said this in 2012. He published this in the Dartmouth publication, their newsletter. Luce had successfully participated in being inducted into a fraternity. But this is what he publishes. I was a member of a fraternity that asked pledges in order to become a brother to swim in a kiddie pool of vomit, urine, fecal matter, semen, and rotten fruit products, eat omelets made of vomit, chum chubs of vinegar, which in one case caused a pledge to vomit blood, drink beer poured down fellow pledges' ass cracks, among other abuses. One of the things I've learned at Dartmouth, one thing that sets a psychological precedent for many Dartmouth men, is that good people can do awful things to one another for absolutely no reason. I want you to ponder that last statement, that good people can do awful things to one another for absolutely no reason. In the case of hazing, if you were a hazer, part of the issue is what kind of individual you are. And I wanted to make that clear that you can be a good person. You can be a religious person, you can be a person who is culturally attuned, and you can still haze. It doesn't mean you're a good person, not a good person. It just means that in this moment, you have license to do something that you would not normally do. I want you to think about that for a minute. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to bring it home as it relates to Delta Sigma Theta. One of the wonderful things about my organization is that our president has established an anti-hazing policy that is designed to stop hazing in its tracks. It's very important that not only that Delta does that, but as panhellenic organizations, our very survival is going to depend on our ability to stop hazing. So I want to cover a few points with you. In Delta, of our 7 regions, the central region is the only one currently, as of these statistics from March 2014, and one is September 2014. Only one region is without a suspension, with a suspended chapter. 20 chapters are currently under suspension, with fines ranging from $1,000 to $5,000. In our region, the South Atlantic region, there are 5 chapters under suspension, including our organization at North Carolina Central. And they have just been suspended last year and will be on suspension until 2016. The South Atlantic region is currently second to the Southern region, with 7 chapters currently under suspension. So we're going to have to hit this twice to bring it up. So this just gives you a breakdown of where these chapters are, where they're located within the region, and this is, of course, in our region. And Alpha Lambda, as I mentioned previously, is currently under suspension. One thing I want you to know about this, we have historically HBCUs represented here. We have huge public, historically white organizations listed here, and private, historically white universities located here. There seems to be no rhyme or reason as to where hazing actually occurs along these lines. The next slide shows the Southern region. And again, you have a mix of HBCUs as well as large public institutions, including Emory University with the Omicron Chi chapter. And Emory is where my personal story of hazing took place. Let's go to the next slide. And stop right there. This is my son as he looked in 2002. Raymond was privileged in a sense. I was teaching at the time at Vanderbilt University. He attended a private institution from the 5th grade to the 12th grade. It was the number 2 preparatory school in the whole region and number 1 in that area. That school that he attended, University School of Nashville, actually used to be a demonstration school for the university's Department of Education before it became independent. There, he received the faculty award when he graduated in 2002. But prior to that, Raymond was that kid who was brainy and smart and ever so slightly quirky, nerdy. He was an athlete. He played basketball. He played baseball. He ran track. He was in a class where only 5 members of the graduating class were of African descent. The rest of the people were majority descent, and most of them were wealthy. We were just in the middle class. I was a professor at Vanderbilt at that time. He was only one of the 5 students in his graduating class to apply to Harvard. He was one of 2, rather, who were accepted. He applied to and was accepted at Harvard, at Princeton, at Duke, at Morehouse, at, where else did he apply? Johns Hopkins. But he accepted, finally, the call to go to Emory University, where he received Emory's highest academic scholarship, the Woodruff Scholarship. Seemed to me that his life was pretty set. Intelligent, a black man in Atlanta, what more could you ask for? He was my only son, and still is my only child. I divorced my husband while I was expecting my son. You might imagine he was, to say the least, the most precious part of my life. I had shown him all along what it was like to be a member of a Greek letter organization. He was in the world when I pledged in 1993, in the spring, in a graduate chapter, a Raleigh alumni chapter. I pledged in a line that also included 3 women who were in their 60s, one of which was my mother. We were not hazed. I was fortunate in that I came into the Sisterhood of Delta in love. Just after the Panhellenic Conventions decreed there would be no more pledging, there would be no more lines. And my son watched that process. He watched it as a person who one day thought he too would join a Greek letter organization and have the kind of experience that I had. In fact, when I moved from Raleigh to Nashville to teach at Vanderbilt, one of the first things I did was to connect with the Delta chapter, where I still to this day have friends because I met them in that chapter and they accepted me in love and sisterhood. While at Vanderbilt, I was one of only a handful of faculty of African descent in the College of Arts and Sciences. As a result, students who came to my classroom knew that they could come to me if they had any kind of difficulty at Vanderbilt, where there was only a 4% population of African descent students at that time. I vividly remember a young man named Michael, who was in my intro to poetry class. Very intelligent student, beautiful young man, who pledged Omega in his sophomore year. He went from being a straight A student to being no student at all. And the last time I saw Michael, he was walking up and down the main drag in front of Vanderbilt, wearing his gold boots and his purple clothes, and he was homeless, and he was hungry, and within 3 years of pledging, he had been arrested for robbery because he was homeless and he was hungry. I made sure my son knew that story. Not just at the point when he was thinking of pledging, but all along. I wanted him to understand the danger he was in. Imagine now, it's very difficult to get an African-American male to the age of majority in this country. You might imagine Michael Brown's parents and Trayvon Martin's parents understand the risks, okay? So you think you're okay. Your son goes off to college, he pledges, and his life is basically over. The young man who was closest to my son, though, pledged Alpha. Brilliant young man. He ended up getting a BA and an MBA within 5 years of Vanderbilt in that program that he was in. And one night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, I hear a car come around my driveway and circle into my backyard. Now, I didn't normally entertain people at 2 o'clock in the morning, particularly people I didn't know were coming. So I get up and I go to the door and I wait for the door to knock. Who is it? It's me, Professor. It's Brian. Brian, what are you doing at my house at 2 o'clock in the morning? Can you let us in? Well, who's with you? My line brothers. I opened the door. They needed a lawnmower, several rakes, all the tools that I had to clean up the yard because they had to go to the graduate chapter's house to make sure that by 8 o'clock in the morning, the grass was cut and the lawn was tended, and it's 2 a.m. He was standing close to me. I knew all of them. I knew all of them very well, but Brian I knew because he'd had a couple classes with me. I felt fairly close to him. I reached up to pat his back and said, Brian, you know you don't have to do that. And when I touched his back, he jumped and flinched. And at that point, I said, take everything I have. Don't worry about bringing it back till you get through. My son woke up and came up. Again, I explained to him this is what was going on. So when he went to Emory, academic scholarship in hand, 16 hours of credit already to his disposal because of his AP classes, having placed out of things because of his grades, he thought his life was going to be pretty good. And soon after, he met a group of young men who were interested in pledging Kappa, not just because of the ideals of Kappa, which all of the Panhandle organizations, all the Greek Medical organizations have high ideals. We don't join these things because we think it would be a waste of our time. We join them because we feel they would make it good for our best and highest good, and we can somehow serve our communities because of our membership there. The other reason why they wanted to pledge Kappa was because all of the members of the organization were supposed to be graduating the upcoming year, so they determined that it was going to be safe. They could not only do what they wanted to do, they could run the yard. Okay? Now, my son was public service minded. He was 13 years old when he got his Eagle Scout. We're talking about a young man who never drank, who never did drugs, who never had a speeding ticket. His life had been an example, so much so that when he won what was called the Faculty Award, the highest award that his high school gives to graduates, all I could say is, one day, son, I want to grow up and be just like you. I had said that repeatedly through his life. Body was sad. He had actually met Usher, Atlanta, good times, happy, met Usher at Target. And he had explained to him about a public service that he wanted to do that involved bringing children from the neighborhoods into Emory, particularly young men, so that they could see that there were college men doing things in the world, that life wasn't just about what you see in video. And part of what he wanted to do was to bring them abreast so that they would be able to take the SAT at the age of 12, as he did as a member of the TIP program, and continue to make those marks. Usher said, give me a call, gave his phone number. Raymond thought his life was set. Needless to say, it wasn't. The hazing process began shortly after they returned from Christmas break. It was all underground. People who were supposed to not be involved in it were involved. The primary hazer actually did not graduate in December, as they thought he would, although everyone else did. He was around. And he stayed around to become a DP once they became a legally recognized chapter. My son soon had 2 nicknames, one of which was Scarface, because he showed the marks so much, they suggested that I not hit him in the head so much. Involved in this hazing process were prominent members of the community, including a medical doctor who was called in to look at Raymond one day when he couldn't move his left arm. And he said, don't worry, it's a stinger, it'll go away. And the process continued. Now, you might imagine I'm pretty close to my son. He called me every night. I tried to dissuade him. I said, son, Kaplan doesn't have anything to lose from you pledging. They only have to gain from you pledging. You got a lot to lose to pledge. Wait till you can join the grad chapter. Wait until X, Y, Z. Why do you need to do it now? And he says, Mom, I'm 18, I'm old enough to make my own decisions, and this is something that I really believe in. So what did I do? I gave up chocolate and bread while he was pledging. I thought I would suffer along with him. That's the best I could do. I have no real bad habits except for chocolate and bread. And I made sure that he connected with me every night. And so that was the beginning of me never turning off my cell phone. For almost 13 years, I could not only turn off my cell phone long enough for updates to take place. And it started in 2003. When he came home from college that summer, I noticed a difference about him. He completed the process. He had his Kappa swagger. He could twirl his cane. But there was something decidedly different about my son. There was no joy in his eyes anymore. As the summer progressed, he took a class at NC State, and fearful all along that he was going to fail. My son would never fail anything. His lowest grade was a B+ in one class in high school, and he was still mad about it. He was afraid he was going to fail his physics class, and it turned out that he got an A+. But he couldn't, his memory was impacted. He couldn't remember things very long. And as the summer progressed, he became more and more small, if I can just put it in those terms. He began to be fearful of sleeping in his room. And he would either sleep in the den, as close to my room as possible. There were times when he had to sleep with me because of the nightmares. There was a time that summer that he would only sleep on the screen porch because he was afraid to be anywhere else. If we went out, he didn't want to be seen. He didn't want to see anybody who looked like him. I started thinking, what could I do to mitigate this process? So his first diagnosis was a diagnosis of depression, and that quickly changed to a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. We were fortunate at that time that people were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. That didn't last very long. We decided that he would go back to school that fall, so the fall of 2003, he sat out of school. Just before we made that decision, though, he turned 19 years old. And he didn't want a party, he didn't want a cake, he didn't want to talk to anybody. His mom brothers called, but they finally determined that they would come and see him. And so they did. That was a birthday surprise for him, but it put him deeper into the hole. I was somewhat at a loss. But throughout that fall, we continued to take him to counseling, and it was determined, this is PTSD. What you need to do is to avoid those young men. But they're my mom. You need to avoid those young men. But that's my you need to avoid those young men. He goes back to January, to the session. I drive down to Atlanta with him. He's greeted by his mom brothers who seem very happy to see him. I thought they understood the consequences of what had happened to my son. But when he called me at my hotel that night, he said they had just left his room and said, "We have an underground line. We just want to know if you're going to tell." This is when things really turned to the worst for Raymond, because he was determined that he would save those people online by going to the sessions but not participating, and that he would be the first line of defense if something went completely awry, if anybody needed to go to the hospital, if somebody needed to be notified, he would be there to do it. It was really a bad idea. What ended up happening, the primary hazer who had been the DP for them was still on campus, still ungraduated, still in charge of the line, and told the new pledges that Raymond wasn't man enough to hit him. They should hit him instead. So altercations ensued. Again, my phone is not off during this time. He's still in struggle, he's still fragile emotionally. And at that point, we did not really understand what had happened to him. He had vast gaps in his memory. There was something he was afraid of, but he couldn't even tell me what it was. He couldn't remember everything that happened to him during the pledge process. By spring break, Raymond had decided that he was going to do two things. He had reconnected with a friend from high school, a Delta, who was at another university in a different city in Georgia. And they were having a little flirtation, and that they were going to come for spring break to North Carolina. But he was also going to reapply to Duke University because he just could not be there with that anymore. And being the conscientious individual that he was, he wanted to make sure that he could still pay his own way academically because the winter scholarship cost nothing. In fact, they paid him to go to school, included a stipend. And so he stayed up day after day after day trying to find the right scholarship opportunity, trying to do this. The fatal issue came at a time when this young woman, Sarah, came to visit. They were about to come to North Carolina, and he said, I'm going to go to the primary Hazing's apartment. I'm going to tell him that I just can't do it anymore, that I'm going to transfer no hard feelings. They go there with two other people, and these two witnesses are the only reasons why I know what happened at that point in time. One of those witnesses had been the victim of a date rape herself, had been drugged at a party, and had a child to show for it. She was hypervigilant, as I said, about things that people ingested that other people ate. And her friend, Raymond, goes, he tells him what he's going to do, and I gotta go, but can you stay for a while, just hang out, no hard feelings? He and Sarah were asked for water, and she immediately fell asleep. Raymond fell asleep. They had to wake them up, the two women who were with him, to come to leave. It took them 2 days to get to Wilmington from Georgia. If you know what happened in those 2 days, I know what happened in those 2 days. I got some phone calls along the way. He got 5 speeding tickets. She got 2. Neither of them had a ticket on their record prior to that. He's in his second semester of his freshman year, in that January, and she's in her senior year. She almost was graduating. By the time they arrived, they barely knew who they were. She was in a daze, and he was talking about himself in the third person. I think maybe they need something to eat. They need some rest. That happened. They woke up about midnight, where Raymond proceeded to tell me that he wasn't going back to school, that instead he was going to stay in Wilmington and start a music career. What ensued was a discussion where he's trying to convince me that this is what's going to happen. And he throws every pillow, every soft object in the room at me to convince me that this was going to happen. And when she comes to and sees this, she decides that he's engaged in domestic violence and dizzily goes and calls the police. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, because of North Carolina laws that says in the instance of domestic violence, you can't say this isn't happening when you are the so-called victim. And I watched them take my son, who had never been in any trouble before, the Boy Scout, my heart, down to the ground and handcuffed. I was told that he needed to either stay in jail that night or be arraigned in the morning, because if they let him go and any difficulty happened, they were going to put him in jail until April. This is early March. It was a very long night. I go to the courtroom the next morning. Sadly for us, there was a high-profile case of a highway patrolman who had been caught dealing drugs. The press were in the courtroom. The judge was feeling all of her power. And by the time my son came out in the afternoon, he had been pepper sprayed during the night. He had been beaten during the night. He had a black eye. She sentenced him to a mental hospital. Wouldn't allow me to take him to my own doctor. And this is a person with no history that could have warranted that. It was so egregious, 3 white attorneys in that courtroom sought me out later, apologized for the judge, and offered me their services pro bono. It took me about a week to be able to see him when he was transferred to the mental hospital, but what he had done was to take an orange crayon and write out 10 pages of what was happening to the young men at Emory and asked me to please get someone there so that they could be rescued. That's the only reason why those young men got off that line without being damaged the way my son was. So began a difficult period in our lives. For the next 13 years, Raymond had diagnosis after diagnosis, drug after drug, and because he was African American and a male, he received the highest dose of anything they could throw at him because he was already perceived as a danger. 13 years, about 20 hospitalizations, and not to mention the things that got him into that hospital. Let's go to the next one. So this sort of encapsulates my son's experience as, I would say, a victim, but I can't really say that because he's a survivor. At some point in the last 2 years, he came to a place of self-realization and recognition. He remembered in part what had happened to him. He learned to forgive the people who hated him. But most importantly, he learned to forgive himself. That turned out to be the deepest part of his hazing experience, is that he blamed himself for the violence that was perpetrated on him. It must have been his fault. But for the grace of God, my son could still be in that circumstance. Hit the button one more time. But this is Raymond in 2014. Can you see him? Is it too dark? Back at Emory, he completed a summer research program working in a neurological lab that focuses on post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and depression. How about that? He did so well in the lab this summer that he's now able to stay in that lab until he graduates. Emory, though they were not helpful when we tried to sue Kappa Alpha Psi, maintained his scholarship. And he will be able to finish his degree within 3 semesters. So I want you to understand that he's a survivor rather than a victim. To the next slide. I want to be grateful again, as I said, that Sarah President Pauletta Walker has made anti-hazing the primary part of her administration. It's so important that we recognize the damage that is done in the hazing process, but more importantly, it's not preventable. It doesn't have to happen. You don't have to be hazed or be a hazer to perpetuate the goals of our organizations. It's nowhere in anybody's bylaws. Next one. It's a crime. And although penalties vary from state to state, you can serve time for hazing. We have a former SARA, Hope in Chattanooga, who was arrested in 2009, who's serving time right now. Kappa has about 3 different sets of young men serving time right now. Young men who were injured around the same time as my son, but one of them happened to be the son of a judge, and that kind of worked in his favor. And sadly for him, he was a track star, and the beatings that he survived damaged his hamstring. He'll never run again. There's a young man in the Atlanta area, who has lost all but his short-term memory. When you talk to him, you have to introduce the subject and yourself every 10 minutes. It's a crime, and there are reasons why it's a crime. And few people are serving time right now. It's not a victimless crime. Even in cases that are not as extreme as that of my son or the other young men that I have mentioned, hazing damages. Prince George's County has a high percentage of people who are members of the Pan-Hellenic organizations. Highly educated African-American people in these spaces. They also have the highest incidence of domestic violence in that state. There has to be some correlation. Even if you don't see the damage, it's there. Next thing. Any hazing policy that blames the victim, that makes the victim responsible for his or her hazing, is also a part of the problem. You would expect a rape victim to be responsible for the issues surrounding her rape. And it's an analogous situation. Next one. If it continues, the Pan-Hellenic organizations will not survive. It's incumbent upon everybody sitting in this room to recognize that. We cannot sustain lawsuit after lawsuit. We cannot afford it. The administrations at the universities where our chapters are housed cannot afford the liability. There are no chapters of Princeton and Harvard. They've abolished them. If we want to survive, if we want our organizations to survive, then we're going to have to make this our business. Otherwise, we will not survive. Next one. As members of Delta, you are empowered to stop hazing. First and foremost, you can stop yourself. And you need to stop that sorrow who comes. Whether she's active or inactive, whether she was your big sister, your ace, your deuce, no matter what she was. Her actions as a hazer not only endanger the individual she's hazing, but endangers our sorority. It's a matter of survival. Not just right and wrong, but it's a matter of survival no matter who she is. Now, sometimes that tends to be a problem, particularly for our collegiate sorors. They find it very difficult to tell their big sisters anything that they don't want to hear. But you are not online. You should not have been hazed to begin with. And you've got to step up to the plate, because they're endangering not only your sorority, but the sorority as a whole. Something my son wanted you to really know. I talked to him as I was completing my process. If you have been hazed and you're in pain, if you're anxious, if you're depressed, please stop for a minute and get help. The longer you hold it, the more in danger you yourself will personally be. And he wanted me to reach out to anybody here who have been hazed to really encourage you to talk to somebody about your experience so that you yourself can be whole. Raymond also wants you to know that you can stop hazing by being truthful to members, people who are interested in membership, about what goes on. One of the things that his line brother said when they were called to give a deposition at Emory, one of the things they said was, no, they weren't hazed. They recognized that Kappa was a non-hazing organization, and before they knew that, they decided to beat each other up so they'd be ready for it if the hazing happened. This is how they supported Raymond in that process. Thankfully, Raymond's roommate, a Jewish American male who was undergoing his own hazing ritual by beer and alcohol, decided to document each other's progress. And Matthew took pictures of Raymond whenever Raymond came home injured. I didn't bring them with me today. They were horrendous. It took me a long time to find the pictures because they did it with a disposable camera. I don't know if you're like me, the disposable cameras laying everywhere over your house when that was in vogue. Well, it took me about 6 tries to find the right camera. I would drop it off at a pharmacy and I'd say there may be evidence of a crime, so just want to let you know before you develop them. And I'd go back and get them and it would be pictures of a cat or a dog. There, one particular day, I was on my way to pick Raymond up from his latest stint in a mental hospital. He had been there about 30 days at the time. And I dropped it off at the pharmacy near the hospital. And I did my spiel. This may contain evidence of a crime. Didn't know it was her. It wasn't a pharmacy that I frequented. It was just close to the hospital. And when I went to pick him up, she started crying when I walked in the door. And she said, whoever did this, you need to make sure they pay. Raymond had a wound on his hip that was about the size, just bigger than a silver dollar. It took about 5 months to close from when a cane was broken on his hip. Not to mention the different colors of the bruises on his back. So again, you need to make sure that when you talk to people about joining an organization, that you're truthful with them about issues related to pledging. And as importantly, if you have been a hazer, stop. Just stop. And talk to someone about your experiences. If you have been a hazer, you too have been damaged in this process. Someone hazed you. You are passing that pain on, but that pain will never end until you reconcile the pain that you yourself have experienced. If you're a hazer, stop and get help for yourself. Next one. Raymond's story could have been a victim story. And for nearly 13 years, he was a victim. I never gave up on Raymond. I always knew he'd get to the other side with some sort of testimony that would actually change or help someone along the way. He He's now at the point where he can do that. Many years before, he would not have been able to do that. But I'm glad to say that he's a survivor now. And I'm damaged by the process. When a young woman comes to me and asks me to write a letter as a member of Delta Sigma Theta, I have not been able to do it. Instead, I offer my phone number and say, if you need me to come and pick you up, my phone is always on, call me. So far, no one has answered, has called, but I know that they have been hazed. I see the damage, but they don't admit to it. We've got to stop holding this in. It's a damaging scenario, and we simply will not survive if it continues. I want you to help me stop hazing by telling Randall's story, by making it your story, by making it our story, and by passing it on. Thank you so much. I know I've thrown a lot of emotional things at you, but please ask. Yes.
I'll get started. Hey, Howard. We're both from Raleigh, Chapter. You hear so many people say they didn't hit me. And you think, well, that's not, that doesn't mean anything. How do you address or how do you approach people who think, well, they didn't hit me, so I wasn't hazed, you know?
There are a lot of excuses for hazing. That's one we hear all the time. Another one we hear is that they haze in football, they haze in the military, and that makes people thin and tough. Well, whatever. We can see from the recent headlines involving football players that they're damaged by that process. But part of what we have to say is that there are all kinds of levels of abuse. There's mental, there's emotional, and these things have as much of impact as the physical damage for itself. We just have to be mindful to remind people of what hazing actually is and the number of different scenarios that can take place along those lines. Thank you for the questions. Anyone else? One more. Nobody wants to know how I got through? Nobody wants to know how I made it over?
I was going to ask that, as someone whose younger brother is considered my stepfather's Greek, so he's considering budgeting and all that stuff like that, how did you get through, like, I guess spiritually, seeing your son like that, day after day or week after week, in the hospital, you knew he was this star student, he was going so far, and I mean, I'm still is, but what really sustained you through those 13 years?
I would have to say that spirituality rather than religion sustained me. And I want people to understand that there may be 17 different ways back to your dorm room or your apartment from here. But to believe that there's just one path to the spirit is problematic. And so I was sustained by a number of those things. As you recall from the introduction, the other thing that sustained me was my work as a healer and in understanding healing cultures from Africa. I actually sought the help of an African healer on Randall's behalf. I sought the help of complementary and alternative cares here, from using Reiki to craniosacral massage to supplements to this, to that, to the other. I never gave up an opportunity to detox his mind, body, and spirit, and his soul. And so I have to say that my connection to the divine, but also people like you who cared enough to say, how's your son? I had two colleagues in particular, whose children were going through different kinds of issues, and we would stop in the hallway and how's yours, how's mine, until one of their sons committed suicide, and we didn't ask that question anymore. But I took every opportunity to be thankful that Raymond survived. There are people who don't survive hazing. That's what I want you to understand. We have 2 Star Wars plaintiffs who died in an automobile accident that Delta is now facing a lawsuit from because of sleep deprivation. The 2 AKAs, if you might be familiar with, who drowned as a part of a hazing ritual. Some people don't survive. And so I also took strength from the fact that as long as he is alive, there's an opportunity for him better experience and a better day. So there's hope in every situation. Sometimes you might not recognize why you're going through an experience. And I kept explaining that to Raymond. But now he's in a lab where he's studying the very things that he struggled with. And he'll be able to make a difference in somebody's life as a result of that. He's a human biology major and plans right now to get an MD PhD and can't decide whether he just wants to do research or whether he also wants to do clinical work, but just one step at a time, make it through the semester. Go to medical school or not. I'm just grateful that he's alive and he has an opportunity to do some other things. So I guess the short answer is gratefulness helped me make it. Anybody else? Yes.
I know that you said it's doing, very much better now, but do you guys still talk about it sometimes? Like, does it ever come up? Does he ever, thinks about that in the past? Or does he ever, call you and just wants to talk about it sometimes?
Yes, and it's helpful for him to have me to talk to. It's also harmful for him to have me to talk to because we don't, part of the issue is as a single mom, and I can't be his whole world, and he understands that right now. And it's been good for him to talk about it. For a number of years, as I said, he wasn't able to face the fear of what could have happened when he couldn't remember was a problem for him. And so he had all of these scenarios in his mind that, what if this happened, what if that happened, what if this, he eventually remembered the levels of assault. But I think the quote that I can give you right now is he says, whenever you speak, I'm not ashamed for anybody to know what I've been through because I've come through on the other side and I'm fine. So yes, we do talk about it, and I hope that one day he'll be able to join me in this work, but that's certainly his decision. But it's a part of a narrative that affected us both, and we do often talk about it. And I think one of the things that he's determined to do is, you have to think about it, he's back at Emory where it happened. I don't know if any of you might understand if you were beaten and sexually assaulted and dragged through the mud in the newspaper. AP Wire picked up the story because here we had this black person at Emory receiving Emory's highest academic scholarship who's completely crazy at this point, often during times just completely out of balance. There was a lawsuit that was dropped because the attorneys just dropped it under pressure from someone else. No one has ever paid a dime of his medical bills other than me over a 13-year period. And there were times when he was in the hospital for almost a year. And so I think it's important for him to talk about it, and he does, but I just salute his strength. Not only is he back at the same campus, he has spoken to the Kappas on campus. Thankfully, because of his experience, that chapter was suspended until every member who was a member during the time that his situation took place graduated, and they have only been back on the yard for a few years. And so the first time he encountered a Kappa, he was like, yeah, I'm Raymond, what's up? And the guy said, well, I know there's two sides to every story. Why don't you come and talk to us sometimes? Raymond says, no problem. So he hasn't gone to a chapter meeting, doesn't intend to be acting in that way, but he does walk upright in the community, and I think that's just awesome. So, in fact, the dorm room where he is in a building where the Kappa office used to be. So I don't know how he walks that path, but he has the strength to do it. Yes? Were you waving?
Oh, no.
Okay. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
I heard you say that the lawsuit was dropped because of outside pressure. So was this from an interest group or other lawyers locally?
The lawyers dropped the lawsuit at a time before. It was a time during his illness that Raymond was completely unbalanced, and though he was able to give a deposition, one of the things that they started to do was to interview other people who agreed to only respond to the questions that they could be granted immunity. And somewhere in that process, the attorneys dropped the lawsuit. I had to act as his guardian for 2 years, and as soon as I got the guardianship papers, I connected with them, and they just have summarily dropped it. At that time, summarily dropped the case without explanation, without notice, except I'm sorry, we just can't continue. So that is a chapter that remains to be resolved. In fact, we still don't have his documentation back from the lawsuit yet. But at a certain point, we had to decide what was important, whether that was where we needed to put our energies, or did we need to put our energies elsewhere. And so we decided to put our energies elsewhere for that. Questions? Okay. I'm going to be available in case you want to talk to me and you just don't want to talk in front of the crowd. You can also reach me via email. You can go to my website at www.smithmckoy.com as well. And if I can be of any help to you as you decide to move forward to save our organizations and to make a difference in the lives of people who want to join in membership by ending hazing, please consider me your partner in that endeavor. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's give Dr. Smith-McKoy another round of applause. On behalf of the Kappa Omicron chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, we want to thank you for coming and participating in our first Hazing Prevention Week, and we want to give you a small token of our appreciation. So that's it. So on behalf of the Kappa Omicron chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, we would like to thank you all for coming out. And if you want to learn more about any of our other events that we're having this week, please visit uncdeltas.com. That's about it. So thank you for coming.